What's up everyone? Welcome back to this week's video where we're going to be discussing a woman who was frozen solid. Make sure to drop a like on this video, subscribe, and turn on post notifications so you never miss a weekly upload. As always, let's get into it. On December 20th of 1980, a 19-year-old girl named Jean was driving her car through Minnesota on the icy roads when she hit a patch of ice and slid out into a ditch. It was freezing cold out, so Jean decided to leave her car in the ditch and then go try to seek some help. Jean eventually made it back to her friend Wally's house, who was a local cattle rancher in Minnesota. Unfortunately, when Jean made it back to Wally's house, she tripped on a piece of ice and then crawled up to his front door. The next morning, when Wally exited his house, he saw Jean lying on the floor, frozen solid, with her eyes wide open. After the shock set in, Wally immediately grabbed Jean by her collar and dragged her onto his front porch. Wally was hoping and praying that Jean hadn't passed away, but when he felt her skin and realized she was frozen solid, his heart sunk. He was immediately convinced that she was dead, but upon studying her face, he began to see a few bubbles come out of her nose. He knew he had to take her to the hospital immediately, but her body was so stiff that he could not fit her into his pickup truck. Wally decided to take his friend's vehicle instead, and after managing to get Jean into the vehicle, decided to drive her to the nearest hospital. After driving 10 minutes, they officially arrived at the hospital and waited about a half hour before they saw a doctor. When the physician arrived in the room, he talked to Wally and told him that there was almost no chance Jean would survive what she had experienced the previous night. The physician decided to use a hypodermic needle on Jean, but the minute the needle touched her skin, it would break because she was frozen solid. The doctor decided to use a thermometer to see what Jean's body temperature was, but her temperature was so low that the thermometer would not get an accurate reading. Her face began to turn a dark gray color and her eyes would not respond to any sort of light change. The staff at the hospital was instructed to use heating pads on her body to slowly defrost her, although they still believed that she was completely deceased. When the doctors could finally get a reading on her body after warming her up, they got a reading of 88 degrees, which is 10 degrees less than the average body is maintained at. After waiting some time, the medical staff detected a very faint pulse. It was only 12 beats a minute, but doctors slowly began to gain some confidence that Jean may actually still be alive. The attending physician believed that Jean was dead and then heard a slight whimper, realizing that she was actually alive and fighting for her life. All of Jean's reactions began to appear approximately 3 hours after she started thawing out. By the middle of the morning, Jean had actually woken up. She began having muscle spasms, and by the middle of the afternoon, she actually started talking coherently. Jean began to experience muscle spasms, and by the middle of the afternoon, she started engaging in coherent speech. All that Jean seemed to be concerned about was how upset her father would be when he realized that she wrecked his car the night before. She told the doctors that it simply felt like she had fallen asleep and then woken up in the hospital the next morning. When other similar cases had occurred, the patients seemed to have permanent damage or injuries that they have their entire life. In Jean's case, she got extremely lucky and was actually released from the hospital that day with no injuries other than blisters on her toes. She went on to talk on many talk shows in the future and even had some TV shows done on her to cover how she miraculously survived such a brutal experience. When Jean recounts her near-death experience, she often tells people that she never saw a light or anything of that sort, which is slightly disappointing to her. Everywhere she goes, she makes sure to have more than enough clothes to keep her warm and still doesn't drive on the back streets due to the icy roads. This is truly a 1 in a million experience that I personally would consider a miracle. What do you think?